everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Adoptions from the Heart TV. I'm your host, Amanda Aliberti. Today, we are super excited to talk about something that we haven't necessarily addressed on AFTHtv, and that is post-adoption depression. So I'd like to welcome two wonderful guests to our video today. We have Rebecca McGee, who's an adoption social worker and our New York program manager, as well as Liz, who's an adoptive parent through Adoptions from the Heart. So welcome, ladies.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah. Rebecca, do you maybe want to start by just giving us a brief overview of what is post-adoption depression, or as some people call it, post-adoption baby blues?
Yes. So post-adoption depression syndrome is a term that was coined in 1995, so not that long ago. It finally acknowledged that adoptive parents can also have the baby blues. The baby blues is a depression that is short-lived, that happens after a new transition to parenthood. It can be a result of the emotional highs and lows of the process, and finally understanding the weight of raising an adopted child. Just this last year in August 2021, the edition of the Adoption Advocate magazine did a big article on post-adoption depression. This was created by the National Council of Adoption, and it reported that anywhere between 8 and 32% of adoptive parents may experience post-adoption depression. So that's a pretty big number. And how we get, what are some of the reasons why people may have post-adoption depression is that even though you didn't physically labor, carry this child and deliver it, there's still a major adjustment after you adopt. There's sleep deprivation, managing the ongoing tasks of diapers, bottles, all of the administrative things that you have to go through, insurance, finding childcare. And then you might be surprised that you suddenly have these emotions about your child's specific birth parents, the unknowns of the adoption. You may feel like you have this giant secret where you're navigating, what do I tell and who do I tell about my child's adoption story? It could be a transracial adoption where you're feeling the weight of navigating your child's birth history and culture in your home. Also, we've seen in the last 2 years with COVID, some families feel this higher pressure to stay in, they're isolated, so they don't have their normal support system. So other people may experience post-adoption depression if they're not feeling immediately bonded with their child. It may feel like you're babysitting someone else's child. We heard that in some of our post-adoption support groups. They felt like they were afraid of a disruption. So bonding is intentional and takes more time and care as you give your child to help you feel connected. And so this can be a challenge sometimes for families. And so it's important to have open communication with your partner or with a family member to talk about how you're feeling.
Sure.
Other factors might be if you're raising other kids and this new placement is disrupting your kids and your family's schedule. Your big kids may be grouchy, they may be resentful of the baby, they may be confused or acting out. The big kids need to be able to bond with the baby too. And it's okay, talking to your family about having all kinds of feelings about a new child that comes into your home. And finally, another reason that families may experience post-adoption depression is that their expectations didn't match with reality. If you were in the process for many years, you may have had an idea in your mind about how the placement would go, what your child would look like, and those don't always match up. And so some people may experience post-adoption depression because of that. Also, being in the hospital, going to the maternity ward, that can trigger some grief and loss about infertility journeys. So these are just some of the reasons why the baby blues, the post-adoption depression may happen. I mean, there certainly are some other reasons why it can happen too.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rebecca, as I was reading some of the material associated with this, I found it very unique in the sense of, in adoption, there is the extra layer of like the adoption situation and potentially the risk, birth parents, revocation period, the timeline, the legality of things that kind of gets added onto some of the things you have to go through just in general when you're taking in a child and going through like the responsibilities, right? So there's that extra layer that has to kind of come on top of that in the adoption world. And I just found that to be very unique. I'd like to bring Liz into the conversation to share your personal experience of what it was like when you were placed with your son back in 2010 and what you experienced.
So for us, it'd been about, I want to say 2 years before before Will was born. So, and he was premature. So he was 7 weeks premature. So, you know, it all just kind of came really fast. It felt like, even though it'd been 2 years, you know, all of these great plans that we had, oh, we've got all this stuff ready to go, you know, to be put in the car. And then Jim's like, it all won't fit. We have to go rent a car. Da, 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 da. So, you know, we hoofed it out to Harrisburg, and he was early. It just felt very, I won't say out of body experience, but it just felt so bizarre, the whole shenanigan.
Well, and sometimes families, especially if you've been waiting for 2 years, the reality of what is this going to actually feel like when we are getting the call, in the car, arriving at the hospital, baby's premature, like all these things being thrown at you, the reality is sometimes different than what you had kind of been thinking about.
Right.
Tell us about what it was like when you got home and kind of what that experience was when you were going through those initial first couple of months of parenting your son.
They were very, 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 very rough. So I already had sleep deprivation big time. And then adding on the stress of Will being in the NICU for 3 weeks, you know, so that increased that. And then with him coming home, because he was a preemie and because he was a very slow eater, he was awake every 2 hours wanting to eat and taking about an hour to eat. So it was just this perpetual thing. So thank God, my mother-in-law stayed with us the first 2 weeks. Yeah, but it was just very, very exhausting, very surreal. And the saddest part is that for the most part, I don't remember a lot about him being little. Like, I think I loved him and I bonded with him, but he didn't feel like he was my child until about a year out. And I didn't fully start really enjoying him till about a year out. But, you know, I would still do all the mom things, but during the day I was in bed, I was hysterical, I was having hallucinations, like hearing voices that weren't in the room, seeing people who weren't in the room, and just, I was a mess. And I kept, you know, and Jim's like, well, what do we, you know, what should we do? I said, I think I need to go to the hospital. I think something is very wrong. And he said, well, I don't think we can do that because they'll take Will back. So it was like this big secret thing where you couldn't get the help that you needed because of the fear that the adoption would be, you know, turned down or whatever. It was really a mess. And I did get very suicidal, and to the point where, you know, there was a couple of times when I think Jim was with him for the day, and he said, why don't you just go out and take a drive? So I drove out to the Delaware Bridge and tried to figure out where I could park the car to get up onto the bridge. And I thought, well, I'm probably more likely going to have a coronary just trying to climb all these steps before I can jump off the damn bridge. So finally, I just told him, I said, I can't, we have to. And luckily I was seeing a therapist at the time, and because just to support through the adoption journey. And so maybe 2 weeks after Will came home, Jim said, well, okay, we'll risk it, because we go into this knowing adoptions of the heart may take him back. But if you're really this bad, then we should risk it. So she was able to, we had to go through all different kinds of med changes and stuff. So it was a real bear. It was not what I had anticipated.
Yeah. Well, first off, Liz, I just want to say thank you for being so vulnerable in sharing your story. I know Will is now 12 years old. Is that right?
Almost. He'll be 12 in June.
Okay. And I know, life today is great, and you have a beautiful family. So the fact that you are being so vulnerable in letting your guard down and sharing some of those really sensitive moments that first
Yeah.
year of his life, I'm hopeful will kind of help our community better understand what families may go through and what we can learn from it. Rebecca, can you maybe share a little bit of your reaction to hearing what Liz went through and pulling out from there some of the indicators of what adoptive families may go through when they first bring their child home that may lead towards post-adoption depression like we're talking about?
Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I think you touched on a lot of the symptoms, especially at the beginning, loss of energy, unexplained sadness, sudden weight loss or gain, increased or decreased appetite, sleep disturbances, inability to concentrate, irritability, crying for no reason, and kind of like what you said, where you're like watching your life outside of your life, where it's almost like I'm watching a movie reel of it, but I'm not really experiencing it. And those are some of the indicators. I think, you, especially the suicidal ideation, any of those things, that's not you at your healthy place, And so I think when you start to see some of my thoughts, some of my behaviors are not, this isn't me. This isn't who I am at my healthy place. I love that you talked to your husband openly about it, and that you guys came to the place where you're like, we need to do what we can to make our family thrive. Because when you're trying to operate, out of an unhealthy place for so long, you're just digging yourself into it. You're not able to separate and move forward. I loved hearing about you talking to your therapist about it too. I think that anytime I hear that our clients have regular therapy sessions going through an adoption process, especially in a long adoption, I'm like, that's amazing, because there are so many highs and lows in the process. And so having a third party who can just process it with you, that's not your family, that's really healthy, just for you to have a safe space to talk. But a lot of what you described seemed like pretty classic textbook symptoms of post-adoption depression, or just depression in general. So, and when you have those symptoms, it's easier to get help with a doctor too, because you're ticking it off and they're like, okay, well, we can find a path for this. We can, like you said, medication adjustment, therapy, trying to figure out self-care. There's a lot of ways you can move forward and create a plan that'll help you. But I think you really just gave a good example of how that can present in families.
And I think it's also important to note that not just women go through this, right? Many men go through it as well. It's not just something associated with females. We've had many men who have experienced post-adoption depression. So we want to make sure we're kind of incorporating them in there as well. I also wanted to touch on something you mentioned, Liz, which is really important, and thank you for saying it. A lot of adoptive families, especially at the beginning part, are very scared to tell their social worker, to call Adoptions from the Heart or whatever agency that they're working with and say, I'm feeling this way. What can I do? What resources do you have? What guidance can you provide? Because there is that fear of, will they take this child back? It really is the complete opposite. It does not mean at all that would jeopardize your potential placement from moving forward. We just want to make sure that you get the help that you need. Rebecca, any kind of response to that? Any experience maybe you have had with families and whether or not they feel comfortable talking about some of the stress, the negatives, the scary moments that they may have?
I remember one family that I worked with. They, at their post-adoption supervisory visits, were very, well put together. They, presented so well. They only talked about all of the happy moments. But then after the adoption was finalized, they came forward and were like, I think I had post-adoption depression, because they were afraid to get help. And that's what those visits are for, is support. We can talk about bonding. We can talk about what are the resources we could connect you to. So I think that's one area where families may not realize the purpose of that. So the supervisory visits after the placement are not just a checklist for court or, prove that you're, attached to the baby, but it's a resource for families. You're paying for a resource. And so when you have a social worker in your home for the 3 or 4 visits after placement, that's a great time to be honest and to talk about the highs and the lows. And so having someone to process that and thankfully our adoption from the heart families you go through a lot of education in the process, but even more so our social workers are constantly being trained. So we can partner together to talk about, resources and things that we're reading or podcasts we're listening to. Sometimes we get that information from our clients. They're like, you got to hear this thing or read this book. And so I think it's a good opportunity to utilize your social worker. They're in your home already. So, and there's a lot of different tools for coming on. And I would love to hear Liz's perspective on what helped her get out of that first.
Talk to us more about what support you received that helped you in getting out of that time.
I think for me, my in-laws are from Jersey, so she actually stayed with us for 2 weeks, which was amazing. So I think the biggest thing for me was getting back to the therapist. And she was actually she worked with the Christiana Care birth center. So she worked with parents who were going through infertility, who had postpartum, etc. So she was easily able to get in there and help me change my medications. That was big for me. And part of it, and Jim and I still really suck at this, we do not have a huge support system. So we didn't have that support system, like call up your girlfriend and say, hey, could you come over for a while or whatnot. That wasn't in place. And that's what I would really say to people who are in the adoption process. It is vital that you have a support system. In fact, I would say have a support system team meeting before you're placed, like have dinner and have your support people over and say, hey, mom and dad, this is my best friend Jill from work, and this is so-and-so, and here's the plan. So you feel like you have someone you can go to and not be embarrassed and ashamed by it. Because I was just like, well, I'm obviously a horrific mother. We've obviously made some huge mistake, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes, in fact, I hired a doula briefly just to make sure that I was doing things right. And she came for an afternoon and she's like, you're doing everything right. You just need to relax and do it. I was like, okay. So just whatever you got to do. I would even say maybe a doula. I don't know. If you don't have a support system, hire, if you have the money, a support system. Do whatever you have to do.
Yeah, Liz, I wanted you to touch on that, the idea of shame and guilt, because a lot of people go through that when they're potentially feeling some of these emotions associated with post-adoption depression. Why do you think there is shame and guilt associated with that? And why are people afraid to reach out, whether it's to a social worker or a therapist or just someone in their life? Why do you think that shame and guilt is still there?
I think for some people, especially they've gone through infertility, they already have, the women perhaps have shame and guilt. I mean, I remember apologizing to my in-laws for the fact that I wasn't able to carry a pregnancy. So you've already got that little crown, that little tiara, and then you start adding more things onto it. It's just this notion that you got all this training, you spent all this money, you wanted this so bad. Now here it is, and you're freaking out and you're a mess.
And our hope, Liz, is that we can break down some of the stigma associated with this by having a platform like this, right? To kind of have these discussions so people realize this is a real thing. This is something that people may experience, and it's okay to admit that you may be having these feelings, and these are the ways and resources we can help combat that. This is the support team you should have in place. These are the people you can call if you are going through that. A question for both of you: what advice would you give somebody who may be showing some of these signs, loss of energy, maybe even suicidal, feeling the sense of like, I don't know what's going on or what I'm doing? What can that person do if they're in that position? To
quote from Frozen 2, just do the next right thing. Sometimes it's just doing the simple steps of parenting and kind of breaking down, when people are in that frozen, paralyzed, I don't know how to take the next step. Sometimes it's just literally, what are you going to do in the next 20 minutes? Let's not think of a lifetime ahead, or even let's not think of the next 24 hours, but what do I need to do to meet my child's needs, to meet my own needs within this next hour? And how can we move forward like that? So sometimes if you're feeling completely stuck, really simplify it and try to work from there. I really love that we're, like what we talked about, we're trying to break the stigma of mental health and post-adoption depression. One of my favorite t-shirts I've seen, it says mental health is health. And that's so true, because this is, our mental health affects even our physical health. And so this shouldn't be shameful. This is not something we can control. You can't control when you're emotionally spiraling. You can't snap out of it or just say, don't think these thoughts. You really need a plan. And so when we look at ourselves as a picture of how can we be at our healthiest, we do need to address this, but without shame, because you can't help it. You can't help that you're going through this, and you spent these years never thinking that this is going to be your reality. So really giving yourself the grace to get counseling, to get help, medication if you need it, and a community of support. Some other practical things I would say, what we've already talked about, getting an adoption therapist. They're adoption competent therapists instead of just, your typical therapist. You can talk to some that'll work with you, work with your kids if you're adopting older kids, talking to family and friends about the importance of bonding with your child. Maybe take off some of the other things that are clouding your head, like I am only going to spend my time taking care of myself and bonding with the baby. I'm not going to do dishes. I'm not doing laundry. I'm not cooking. What can I outsource till I get this figured out? And so getting, having a plan for who's going to help me with this. I love what Liz said about having a pre-adoption meeting with your support team, and maybe things that you can already think of, like these things suck me dry. I hate doing dishes. I hate doing laundry, or whatever the thing is that, you feel like cripples you emotionally or zaps you of your strength. And saying, can I outsource those for this time? Just like a person who would have had a pregnancy and delivery, they need that 6 weeks of physical recovery. You're going through the, same sleep deprivation, same, emotional highs and lows after a placement. If you're in the NICU, then you have weeks of driving to the NICU, being out of your element. You're behind on all the other things in your life. Maybe you have work deadlines that they're not being accommodating to you, needing to be on leave. And so trying to figure out what can I simply manage, figuring out what self-care looks like in a new stage of life. We talked to our adoptive families before placement. What does self-care look like for you? Maybe it's exercise, maybe it's having a night to watch my favorite TV show once a week, or, getting, time to yourself, taking a long bath, whatever. What can that look like in this new season? How can we translate what self-care is, so that you're not constantly pouring out of an empty cup, but how can we fill you back up? Even if it's just like every Monday, I'm going to have an hour of time to myself, like for, and I get to decide how I'm going to do with it. And it's not a productive time. It's not grocery shopping or getting laundry done, but an hour where I get to sit and rest. And that is also considered productive. If you're in a partnership, maybe how to figure out how to maintain connection. Can you have at-home date nights? Can you have a set time where you're like going to do a check-in every Monday, Wednesday, Friday? We're going to have an intentional, what do you need from me? What do I need from you? How can we support each other better? So having like a regular you're in this together partnership check-in. And I think just not letting the stigma of, a lot of times as parents, we feel like we've been preparing for this for years. I shouldn't need help because I've wanted this. But any new parent needs help. You can't parent alone. Even, you always need a community, whether it's daycare or people to help you, or, your kids' teachers. We need people to be in this journey with us. And that starts even as newborns, because as little as they are so much work.
Thank you, Rebecca. Same question for you. If you can think back to that woman who was placed with that beautiful little boy in 2010, what would you have done differently, or what could you have used in that moment that could be a good suggestion for somebody else?
I think what I could have used that wasn't, I don't think, in place yet with Adoptions from the Heart, but I remember while we were in the adoption process, there was this awesome support group that we would have in certain evenings. And I found that really helpful, just to have someone else to talk to. Because I know when I talked to Jenny, my husband's cousin, that was completely reassuring, because Jenny has all of her crap together. I thought, there's no way you went through anything like this. You're perfect. And it's like, no, just to have someone else to talk to, I think.
Yeah. And thank you for saying that too. Like, I'm not perfect. And people have these expectations of who we are and what we're capable of. And when they hear any sense of maybe I'm not living up to that expectation, you just feel like a failure. So thank you for saying that. Rebecca, did you want to touch on something?
I wanted to say another plug for, we do have a waiting family support group. It meets every other month. And you can get connected with other families. You know, we have our annual adoption picnic. Those are coming up this summer. So now when we're going through the process, connecting with other parents who are, you know, in the process together. I mean, even at our ed courses and our profile meetings, going ahead and exchanging emails and connecting with families early. And you can talk about questions about the profile, questions about waiting, questions about, you know, how do you feel about that consider email? These are all things that can lay a good foundation of friendship. And so being able to step out of your comfort zone and make those friendships, you know, and when you're on those, even the Zoom waiting family support group, there may be someone where you're like, I really liked what they had to say and I would love to follow up with them about that. Do that, reach out, you know, you can put it in the chat, like, hey, I'd love to connect, or reach out to the social worker and see if they like say, I want to give my contact information to this. Can you make that happen? You just have to take that hard first step of reaching out and making friends and being vulnerable to say, hey, do you want to be my friend? You want to talk to me? So it's just harder as adults to do that.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. Rebecca, you've offered us an extensive amount of just resources and education behind post-adoption depression. Liz, again, thank you for being vulnerable enough to talk about some of those personal, really scary moments of when you first brought your son home, because everybody assumes a lot about the different members of the adoption triad, and specifically for adoptive parents, people do think that you do have to be these perfect individuals, right? You waited for so long, you went through this extensive process, you're handed this beautiful baby, so pop, everything should just be great. And that's not always the way it is. And I'm really happy that you came onto this platform, shared your story, and could hopefully help other folks who may be experiencing similar feelings that you have had. So thank you both again. We are hopeful that our community has learned a ton about post-adoption depression. Please feel free to always follow up with your adoption social worker, or go online and learn some new information about this specific topic. So thanks again, guys, for tuning in, and we will see you all soon.